Some buildings don't just shelter, they press down like a hand on your neck. Some streets don't just guide traffic, they slice through communities like scars. Some walls don't just protect, they cage. Architecture isn't neutral. It sees, it judges, it punishes. Today we talk about how space becomes violence. Architecture is the slowest form of violence. That's what Eyal Weizman, an architect and activist, once said. It's a sentence that lingers. At first it sounds strange. Architecture? Violence? Aren't buildings just walls, doors, and roofs? Aren't cities simply where we live, work, and pass through on our way to something else? Slow violence doesn't explode. It doesn't grab headlines. It doesn't leave ruins that cameras rush to capture. Instead, it creeps. It builds over time. You don't always see it until the damage is done. The term came from writer Rob Nixon. He used it to describe harm that unfolds gradually and out of sight. Years later, architect Eyal Weizman gave it a new frame. He showed how slow violence hides in blueprints, in building codes, in the way we shape our streets and cities. He showed how architecture can deliver harm that is legal, quiet, and long-lasting. When people think of violence, they often picture fire, smoke, and sirens. But slow violence doesn't need fire. It needs paperwork. It needs maps. It needs someone with power drawing lines that decide who gets to live where, who gets access to safety, and who is left behind. In this kind of violence, the tools aren't weapons. They're zoning laws, funding decisions, and planning meetings. And once the harm is built in, it stays. Take zoning laws. These are local rules that decide what kind of buildings go where. On the surface, zoning sounds dull, but it shapes everything. It decides whether a neighborhood will have apartments or only single-family homes. It controls whether factories sit near schools. It sets limits on who can afford to live in certain places. In many U.S. cities, zoning has been used to protect wealth and keep poor people, and especially people of color, out. One common example is single-family zoning. This rule blocks apartments and cheaper housing from being built in certain areas. The result is a neighborhood that stays rich and white while pushing everyone else to the edges. Now look at redlining. In the 1930s, the U.S. government and banks created maps that marked which neighborhoods were safe to invest in. The red lines were drawn around black neighborhoods. If you lived inside one, banks wouldn't give you a mortgage, developers wouldn't build there, services would shrink. These places became stuck in cycles of poverty, not because of who lived there, but because of how the system treated them. That's slow violence. It's damage made by design. Housing segregation is another layer. It didn't happen by chance. White homeowners often used legal tools called restrictive covenants to keep out black families. Some cities built public housing far from job centers or near polluting factories. Others cut off bus lines to prevent poor families from reaching wealthier schools or safer parks. Over time, these choices made some areas thrive and others fall apart. Kids born into one zip code might live 10 years longer than kids just a few miles away. Not because of biology, because of buildings, boundaries, and blocks. Even infrastructure can carry harm. Highways often run straight through the heart of black and brown communities, not because it was the shortest route, but because those areas had the least power to fight back. In the 1950s and 60s, cities used highway construction to clear out neighborhoods they called slums. The homes were bulldozed, the families displaced, generations of memory and community wiped out. Once the road was built, the noise, pollution, and danger remained. In other cases, the harm comes from what's missing. In some neighborhoods, you won't find sidewalks, streetlights, or working bus stops. You won't find clean water, green space, or medical clinics. These things aren't luxuries. They're what people need to stay healthy and safe. When they're missing, the risk grows. Kids breathe dirtier air. Elderly residents have no safe way to walk to the store. Parents must travel hours to find a decent school or a doctor. The neighborhood becomes a place where just living takes a toll. This is what Weizmann means when he says architecture decides who gets to breathe, who gets to move, who gets to thrive, or who gets watched. A school without windows or trees teaches kids something about their place in the world. A housing project boxed in by highways limits how far someone can go. A public bench designed to prevent sleeping sends a message. Some people belong here, others don't. Imagine two children growing up in the same city. One lives in a leafy suburb with parks, libraries, and good schools nearby. The other lives across town in a place with crumbling buildings, mold in the walls, and no public transit. They both wake up, but their paths diverge the moment they step outside. One walks to school on a clean, shaded street. The other waits for a bus that may not come, next to a busy road with no sidewalk. This is what slow violence looks like. It doesn't strike once. It wears people down. The pain isn't just physical, it's emotional, it's psychological. Living in a space that tells you you're not worth much, whether through neglect, surveillance, or control, changes how you see yourself. Over time, it changes what you expect from life. That's the deepest wound of all. We don't often blame architecture for these things. It's just the background, we think, just the setting. But in truth, the setting is part of the story, and sometimes it writes the story. When cities are built to separate rather than connect, when homes are placed to isolate rather than protect, when space is designed to watch rather than welcome, then architecture is no longer shelter. It becomes a structure for harm. And because buildings last, so does the damage. It's built in brick, steel, and concrete. It's enforced by maps, permits, and policies, and it takes years, even decades, to undo. That's why Weizmann calls it the slowest form of violence. Because by the time we notice, it's already part of the landscape. In Atlanta, the design of neighborhoods tells a long story about race, power, and who gets to live where. In the early 20th century, the city's zoning laws were openly racist. Officials used them to separate black and white residents, often placing black neighborhoods near industrial zones and white neighborhoods near schools, parks, and clean water. These decisions weren't just social, they were built into the city's legal code. Even after the courts struck down racial zoning, the pattern stayed. The language changed, but the effect remained. Single-family zoning became the tool of choice. It sounds harmless, even technical, but it was powerful. It made it illegal to build apartments or multifamily homes in large areas of the city, especially in wealthy, mostly white neighborhoods. That meant affordable housing couldn't be built where better schools, safer streets, and better jobs were located. In practice, single-family zoning preserved segregation. A working-class black family couldn't move into these areas, not because of their income alone, but because the zoning wouldn't allow the kind of housing they could afford. At the same time, disinvestment and redlining ensured that black neighborhoods received less support, fewer public services, worse infrastructure, and limited access to credit. It was a double bind. People were kept out of better neighborhoods, and their own neighborhoods were denied resources. Today, the legacy of these decisions is easy to see. Some areas of Atlanta remain almost entirely white and wealthy, while others are majority black and underserved. Access to good schools, hospitals, and public transit still depends on your zip code. These lines were drawn a century ago, but they continue to shape opportunity. You can see the effects in housing prices, in who rents and who owns, in how long it takes to get to work or to a doctor's office. A young black family today might still face the same barriers their grandparents faced, not through explicit racism, but through the built environment. The rules on paper may seem fair, but the outcomes are not. Zoning doesn't have to be violent to do harm. It doesn't need police or bulldozers. It works through meetings, permits, and maps. That's what makes it an example of slow violence. The harm builds over time. It limits where people can live, how they can build wealth, and what kinds of futures they can imagine for their children. When Eyal Weizman talks about architecture deciding who gets to thrive, this is what he means. A law passed decades ago still controls who gets access to safety, stability, and growth. And unless it's changed, it will continue to divide. In Palestine, architecture doesn't just shape the landscape, it shapes lives under occupation. The terrain, the roads, the houses, even the ruins, they're all part of a system that controls where people go, how they live, and what they see. This is the world that Eyal Weizman studies. He's an Israeli architect who has spent years investigating how buildings and planning are used as tools in the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. His work shows that architecture can be more than a backdrop to conflict. It can be a weapon. Weizmann describes the occupation as a kind of slow violence, and the environment as one conceived to strangulate Palestinian communities. That word, strangulate, is exact. It captures the way space is used not to kill all at once, but to suffocate over time. The violence isn't just about bullets or bombs. It's about how towns are divided, how people are watched, and how freedom is slowly taken away through design. In the West Bank, Israeli settlements are often built on the tops of hills. At first glance, that might seem like a simple choice. High ground offers better views, more breeze, maybe even a sense of status. But this placement is not innocent. It serves a purpose. From these heights, Israeli settlers and soldiers can look down on Palestinian villages below. It creates a constant visual presence, a watchtower effect. People living under these eyes can't forget that they are being watched. They may not see the soldiers, but they know they're there. That awareness becomes part of daily life. It shapes how people move, speak, and gather. The feeling of being observed doesn't go away. This is what Weizmann compares to a panopticon, a structure where surveillance is constant and control becomes internalized. Surveillance isn't limited to vision. Roads are part of it too. Israeli-only bypass roads cut through the land, allowing settlers to move quickly and securely between settlements, while Palestinians must take long, winding routes. Checkpoints add another layer of delay and uncertainty. A short trip can turn into hours of waiting. Movement becomes a privilege, not a right. Then there are the walls. The separation wall, or barrier, is over 700 kilometers long in parts of the West Bank. It doesn't follow the border. It cuts deep into Palestinian land. In some places, it runs right next to homes or schools. The wall towers above daily life. It isn't just a physical divide. It sends a message. It says you are on this side, and you are being contained. People who used to walk to work or visit family nearby are now blocked. What was once a 10-minute walk might become a 40-minute detour, or a trip that isn't possible at all. The wall is not just about stopping movement. It's about separating lives and shaping thought. Homes are not spared. During military operations, Israeli forces have used Palestinian homes in urban areas as tools of movement and control. In cities like Nablus and Jenin, soldiers have entered homes not through doors, but through walls. They break through one house into another, creating a path through private spaces. Living rooms become hallways. Bedrooms become temporary posts. These are not random acts of destruction. They are tactics. By avoiding streets, the military avoids exposure. But at the same time, it violates the privacy and safety that homes are supposed to provide. Imagine sitting with your family when suddenly a wall collapses. Armed soldiers appear in your home, stay for hours or days, then leave. What does that do to your sense of security, to your memory of that place? The destruction of homes goes further. Some are demolished as punishment or for lacking permits that are nearly impossible to obtain. Others are damaged during raids or conflicts. A home isn't just shelter. It holds memory, identity, and community. Destroying it sends a message of power. It removes not just walls, but also the life built inside them. Weizmann's work connects these acts to a larger pattern. He doesn't look at a single wall or road in isolation. He maps them, studies their positions, measures their shadows. He shows how the physical environment tells a story of occupation. And he doesn't stop at analysis. Through his group Forensic Architecture, he turns space into evidence. They use satellite images, 3D models, and witness accounts to reconstruct events. In courtrooms and reports, this evidence is used to demand accountability. Buildings become witnesses. Craters, rubble, and ruined facades speak to what happened when no one was looking. The power of this work lies in its clarity. It makes visible what is often ignored. It shows that the occupation is not just about soldiers or politics. It's built into the ground. It's in the layout of a neighborhood, the direction of a window, the path of a road. Every decision about where to build, what to allow, what to restrict, these are acts of control. Weizmann's findings change how we see the built environment. They force us to ask what a building is doing beyond its walls. Is it offering safety, or is it trapping someone in place? Is it providing a view, or is it being used to watch others? In Palestine, these questions are not abstract. They are daily reality. When you walk through a town and see homes under constant surveillance, when you see roads that split one community from another, when you see people waiting at a checkpoint, while others pass with ease. You start to understand how space can be used to divide. You see how architecture can shape not just the land, but the life that unfolds on it. And that's the heart of Weizmann's work. He's not just talking about buildings, he's talking about power. He's showing how architecture becomes a system of control, quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. A system that tells people where they can go, what they can see, and how much of their own lives they get to decide. This isn't violence that ends in a day. It's violence that stays, that shapes generations. It's planned, drawn, and built. It's not always loud, but it's always there. And once you see it, you can't look at space the same way again. The settlement of Eyal sits on a ridge in the occupied West Bank. From that high ground, it looks out over the Palestinian villages below. This isn't just about the view. The location is strategic. It offers wide visibility and control. It's a form of architecture used to watch and dominate. The design of Eyal turns geography into a tool of surveillance. For the Palestinian communities nearby, this changes daily life in quiet but powerful ways. When people know they're being watched, even if they don't see the watchers, they change how they act. The gaze from above creates a kind of invisible pressure. It's not always physical, but it is constant. People walk differently, they speak more carefully, they stay indoors more often. The psychological weight of being under watch can shape entire communities. It creates fear and limits freedom, even without a direct confrontation. The roads leading to and from Eyal reinforce this control. Israeli-only roads link the settlement to other areas and bypass Palestinian towns. These roads are smoother, faster, and safer if you're Israeli. For Palestinians, the presence of checkpoints, barriers, and restricted areas turns everyday travel into a slow, uncertain process. Getting to work, to school, or to a hospital can take hours instead of minutes. The land is the same, but the experience of it is not. Eyal isn't just a group of houses on a hill. It's part of a network. Each settlement built on high ground connects with others to form a pattern of control. It's a pattern that cuts across Palestinian land, breaks up movement, and fragments territory. The idea is not only to occupy space, but to dominate how that space is used and perceived. From above, soldiers and settlers can see villages, fields, and roads, but from below, the view is limited. Palestinians see fences, walls, and the steep slope above them. This imbalance is no accident. Eyal Weizman describes it as a form of spatial domination. Architecture becomes a quiet weapon. It doesn't explode, it doesn't shout, but it shapes how people live and how they feel. The position of Eyal says something without words. It says, "We are above you, we see you, and you do not control what happens here." Even at night, the difference is visible. The settlement is lit, developed, and secure. The villages nearby may deal with power cuts, poor infrastructure, or restricted development. The contrast sends a message. One side expands, the other is held in place. This use of elevation, of planning, of control through design, this is what turns a building into a tool of occupation. Eyal, like many other settlements, isn't neutral. It's part of a larger system that uses architecture not just to shelter, but to watch, separate, and dominate. Forensic architecture is not a typical architecture firm. It doesn't design buildings, it investigates them. Founded by Eyal Weizman, it is a research agency based in London that uses architecture as a method of evidence gathering. The team includes architects, filmmakers, coders, and lawyers. Together, they examine violence, especially when that violence is denied or hidden. Their work focuses on war crimes, state violence, and human rights abuses. They do not rely on a single method. Instead, they combine satellite images, 3D modeling, witness videos, and architectural analysis to reconstruct what happened in places where traditional evidence may be missing or disputed. Forensic architecture is built on a powerful idea that space holds memory. A building can remember a strike. A shadow can reveal the hour of an attack. A crack in a wall can tell a story. Their work assumes that space itself can act as a witness. Even after people are gone, even when stories are silenced, the traces remain. These traces, if studied carefully, can speak. Weizmann often says that the crime was committed on the drawing board. This means violence can begin long before any bullet is fired or bomb dropped. It can begin with a blueprint, with a planned road that cuts a town in half, with a housing policy that pushes one group out, with the placement of a surveillance tower or a checkpoint. When architecture is used to control, to isolate, or to destroy, the violence is premeditated. It starts with a design decision, with a line on a map, with the way a structure is positioned. And once built, these decisions have real, lasting consequences. Forensic architecture often works in places where official investigations fail, in conflict zones where states refuse access, in cases where eyewitnesses are not enough, or when governments deny what happened. In those moments, architecture becomes a kind of testimony. One case involved an airstrike in Gaza. The Israeli military denied responsibility for the deaths of civilians, but survivors described what they saw. Forensic architecture gathered these accounts, matched them with satellite images, and reconstructed the building in 3D. They traced the shadows from nearby buildings to calculate the exact time of day. They examined the size of the crater left by the bomb. Piece by piece, they built a timeline. In the end, the structure itself, damaged, partly collapsed, helped prove what had happened. It became more than rubble. It became evidence. Another case took place in Syria. A chemical attack had left dozens dead, but access to the site was blocked. Instead of relying on government sources, forensic architecture used videos uploaded by witnesses. They matched these videos with satellite data. They studied the damage pattern. They tracked the movement of clouds and smoke. Using open-source tools and architectural logic, they recreated the scene. Their findings were later used in human rights reports and legal discussions. Again, space told a story when human voices alone were not enough. In Mexico, the agency worked on a case involving the disappearance of 43 students in Iguala. Official reports were full of holes. Forensic architecture traced cell phone signals. They mapped the routes of police vehicles. They studied witness testimony in relation to the urban layout. They showed that the state had played a much bigger role in the incident than it claimed. Their work didn't solve the case, but it reopened it. It pushed for new questions and more honest answers. In each case, what stands out is the method. Forensic architecture treats architecture as a tool, not to create space, but to reveal what space has already recorded. They look at the way walls bend, how ceilings collapse, where debris falls. They listen to background sounds in videos. They note changes in light and shadow. All of this builds a case, step by step. This is not easy work. It takes time, precision, and often great care. Many of these sites are places of trauma. They are not just data points. They are homes, schools, marketplaces, places where people lived and died. The goal is not to sensationalize the damage, but to give it meaning, to use it to seek justice when justice might otherwise be denied. Forensic architecture also uses its findings in court. They have presented their evidence in international hearings, before human rights commissions, and in public exhibitions. Their models are not just visuals, they are arguments. They are structured to make complex truths understandable. A cracked floor plan, a shattered roof, or a sudden hole in a ceiling, these can all become part of a legal case. They can speak for those who can no longer speak. What makes this work powerful is its clarity. Forensic architecture doesn't rely on slogans. It doesn't rely on emotions. It relies on facts that can be verified. And it presents those facts in ways that make sense to both experts and the public. In doing so, it challenges the silence that often follows violence. It fills the gaps left by failed institutions. It refuses to let buildings be mute. Sometimes their findings are uncomfortable. They show complicity. They expose lies. They challenge narratives told by powerful states. But that's the point. Forensic architecture is not neutral. It takes a stand. It uses the tools of architecture to uncover truth, even when that truth is hard to face. Eyal Weizman has said that architecture is often where violence is planned. But through this work, he also shows that architecture is where resistance can begin. In the marks left behind, in the evidence hidden in shadows, in the careful reading of what others tried to bury. Buildings, ruins, even shadows become witnesses in court, and sometimes they are the only ones left. Saydnaya Prison is a military detention center in Syria, located just north of Damascus. The Syrian government has kept the site closed to outside observers. Journalists, inspectors, and human rights groups have been denied access. Still, many reports have described Saydnaya as a place of mass detention, torture, and secret executions. Without physical access, it seemed impossible to confirm what was happening inside. That's where forensic architecture stepped in. Working with Amnesty International, forensic architecture used testimonies from former detainees to reconstruct the prison. These were not simple interviews. Survivors had spent years in near-total darkness, confined to small cells, often blindfolded. They hadn't seen the building clearly, but they remembered details, sounds, footsteps, door slams, echoes, the rhythm of guards' movements, and the shape of rooms based on how sound bounced back to them. The team used these memories to map out the space. They sat with survivors and played back specific sounds: doors opening, boots on metal stairs, water dripping. As each sound played, survivors recalled what they heard and where they were. By matching these memories with known architectural standards for prisons and military buildings, forensic architecture slowly pieced together a model of Saydnaya. This was not just a sketch. It was a full architectural model, showing cell blocks, corridors, staircases, and execution rooms. As the model took shape, survivors confirmed its accuracy. They pointed out where beatings took place, where they were held in isolation, where they heard others cry out. One detainee described hearing a door open and close regularly, followed by silence and then the dragging of bodies. That pattern became part of the evidence. It suggested the routine of executions. The final product was more than a model. It was a record of violence built from memory and architecture. It showed that even without access to the site, it was still possible to document state abuse. The work exposed how the Syrian regime used space not only to confine, but to terrorize and erase. Torture didn't happen in some random room. It happened in a space designed to allow it, to hide it, and to repeat it without being seen. The Saydnaya investigation later informed UN reports and human rights briefings. It also stood as proof that architecture can serve as testimony, even in darkness, even without photographs or documents. The structure itself, through memory, through sound, through reconstruction, became a witness. This case shows what forensic architecture does best. It uses the tools of design not to build, but to reveal. By treating survivors as experts of their own experience, and by trusting their memory of space, the project gave voice to those who had been silenced. It also showed that in places built to hide truth, space can still speak. Design injustice is not limited to war zones or occupied territories. It happens in quiet neighborhoods, overlooked corners of major cities, and even in places that call themselves progressive. The United States, the United Kingdom, and other wealthy nations carry long histories of shaping space in ways that exclude, segregate, and harm. It's a global pattern, different details, same logic. In the U.S., redlining set the stage. Starting in the 1930s, federal housing agencies and private banks created maps to guide investment. Neighborhoods with black residents or immigrants were outlined in red and labeled too risky for loans. Banks stopped lending. Developers pulled out. Over time, the difference between redlined and non-redlined areas grew wider. Wealth flowed into some neighborhoods. Others were left behind. These decisions were not based on income, crime, or building quality. They were based on race. This is how racism was built into the shape of cities. Zoning laws added to the damage. These local rules decided what could be built where. In many cities, they were used to block low-cost housing from wealthy areas. Single-family zoning made it illegal to build apartments in large zones, which kept poor people, and often people of color, out. Officials said they were protecting neighborhood character, but what they protected was racial and economic segregation. The effects still last. Today, many wealthy areas remain mostly white, with large houses and open space, while poorer neighborhoods are dense, underfunded, and isolated. Design injustice is not always visible from a distance. Sometimes it takes the shape of a highway. During the mid-20th century, the U.S. built a national highway system. This massive project reshaped cities. In many cases, highway planners routed roads directly through black neighborhoods. In Detroit, the construction of Interstate 375 destroyed the Black Bottom District, a center of black culture and business. In New Orleans, Claiborne Avenue, once lined with oak trees and a vital hub of community life, was buried under an overpass. Homes were lost, businesses were closed, community connections were broken. These were not accidents. Planners often chose routes that caused the least political resistance. That usually meant cutting through poor neighborhoods that had little power to fight back. The result was lasting harm, displacement, pollution, and decline. When you drive on these highways today, you may not notice what they replaced, but the people who lived there remember. Some never recovered. Environmental racism is another layer. Across the US and the UK, polluting industries, waste treatment plants, and highways are more likely to be placed near low-income communities and communities of color. This isn't just unfair, it's deadly. In some areas, residents live with higher rates of asthma, cancer, and other chronic illnesses. In Louisiana's Cancer Alley, refineries line the Mississippi River, pumping toxins into the air near black communities. In Flint, Michigan, lead-contaminated water poisoned thousands, mostly black residents. These are not isolated cases. They are part of a pattern where the safety of one group is traded for the convenience or profit of another. In London, public housing tells a similar story. Poorer residents are often pushed to the outer edges of the city, far from jobs and services. Tower blocks are neglected, elevators fail, stairwells are dark. Some buildings are cladded in cheap materials, with tragic results, as seen in the Grenfell Tower fire. That disaster wasn't only about flames. It was about years of ignored warnings, cost-cutting, and a failure to value the lives of low-income residents. The building became a symbol of what happens when design is driven by profit rather than care. Design injustice also shows up in the small details. Think of a city with no curb cuts for wheelchairs, no safe sidewalks for pedestrians, no buses running after dark. Think of a school surrounded by fences and floodlights, built to keep kids in line rather than to help them grow. Think of housing projects with no parks, no shade, no grocery stores nearby. These design choices say something about how people are seen. They send messages. You are not welcome here. You don't matter as much. You are being watched. We call this lived-in design injustice because it shapes everyday life. It's not dramatic like a demolition. It's steady, quiet, and constant. It shows up in how far someone has to walk to get clean water, in how long it takes to reach a doctor, in how many transfers it takes to get to work. It's in the extra hours spent waiting at a bus stop in the cold. It's in the noise of a highway that never sleeps. It's in the absence of green space or the presence of surveillance cameras on every corner. Sometimes, oppression is measured not in broken glass, but in miles walked to access clean water. That phrase might sound poetic, but it's real. It reflects the slow drain on people's time, health, and dignity. These are not natural conditions. They are designed. The design of public space decides more than what buildings look like. It decides who has access to resources, who is exposed to risk, and who is seen as worth protecting. When a neighborhood has no shade, no clinics, and no transit, it isn't a mistake. It's the result of policy. When schools in poor areas look more like prisons than places of learning, it's not just about budget, it's about what those students are expected to become. This doesn't mean every architect or planner sets out to cause harm, but intent is not the only thing that matters. Outcomes matter too. And when the same communities keep bearing the brunt of poor design, we have to ask harder questions. Who is shaping these spaces? Who are they serving? And who gets left out? Across cities, these patterns repeat. In every case, the design of the environment reflects larger systems: racism, classism, ableism. The damage may not be fast, but it is deep, and it lasts. If we want to understand inequality, we can't just look at laws and policies. We have to look at buildings, streets, and maps. We have to see how design either supports life or limits it. Claiborne Avenue was once the heart of the Treme neighborhood in New Orleans. It was more than just a street. It was a gathering place lined with oak trees, small businesses, and homes. Black families owned property there. Music, food, and celebration filled the space. Parades passed through it. It was part of the social and cultural life of the community. Then came the highway. In the 1960s, the federal government expanded the interstate highway system. Planners chose to run Interstate 10 directly over Claiborne Avenue. They did not route it through nearby commercial areas or wealthier white neighborhoods. Instead, they placed it over the middle of Treme, where they faced less political resistance. This was not a neutral decision. It was a clear example of how urban planning and federal infrastructure projects were used to reshape Black communities. Construction began. Trees were cut down. Homes and businesses were demolished. The elevated highway cast a shadow over what remained. The noise from traffic filled the air. The space that had once been central to community life became dark, loud, and unsafe. It no longer supported gatherings. It no longer supported the same economy. Local shops lost foot traffic. Property values dropped. People moved away. Others couldn't afford to leave and watched their neighborhood decline around them. This pattern was not unique to New Orleans. Similar projects took place in cities across the U.S., in Detroit, Miami, Atlanta, and more. But the case of Claiborne Avenue shows how clearly design choices can cause harm. The decision to put a highway through the heart of a black neighborhood was not about engineering alone. It was about power. The state chose where to invest and where to disrupt. It chose who would benefit from faster travel and who would pay the price. The harm continues today. The underpass is still there. Some efforts have tried to bring the space back, adding murals, pop-up markets, or green space, but the damage from the original decision is hard to reverse. Families lost homes. Businesses never returned. The social bonds that made the area strong were stretched thin. The community was not only disrupted, it was changed by force. Claiborne Avenue is now studied as a clear example of environmental racism and design injustice. The noise, the air pollution, the disinvestment, these were not accidents. They were the result of planning decisions made without regard for the people who lived there. That's what makes this case an example of slow violence. The harm was not immediate, but it was deep. It lasted. It shaped what people could do, where they could go, and how they lived. A highway on a map became a wound in a neighborhood, and the space that once held life became a symbol of loss. Architecture reflects power. It also helps keep power in place. It shows us who is in control and who is not. The shape of a city, the location of a wall, the layout of a housing block, these things carry meaning. They speak to decisions made by people in rooms far from where the effects are felt. When a new building goes up, it may look like progress, but if it displaces people, limits access, or favors one group while ignoring another, it carries harm. And that harm lasts. The built environment doesn't just hold us, it shapes our daily lives, our movements, our options. When people suffer because of it, we can't call it neutral. This is why architecture must be held accountable. It's easy to see buildings as passive, but buildings are not blank. They are filled with intention. Sometimes that intention is helpful, sometimes it is not. When a community is cut off from jobs and schools because of zoning laws, that is not a natural outcome. It is designed. When public housing is placed next to a highway, or when a neighborhood has no access to clean water, those choices are written into the plans. They come from somewhere. They often come from systems that favor profit, control, or exclusion over care, access, or safety. We live with those choices every day. A bus stop without a bench tells older people they don't belong there. A sidewalk that ends before reaching public housing tells families they are not a priority. A school with bars on the windows tells students what society expects from them. These are messages written in concrete and steel. They're not accidents. They come from values that are expressed through budgets, maps, and building codes. So when people say architecture is apolitical, they miss the point. It is never apolitical. It always reflects something. The only question is what and for whom. In places like Gaza or the West Bank, this becomes even more clear. A wall is not just a barrier, it is a message. A checkpoint is not just a security measure, it is a method of control. A settlement placed on a hill is not just about land, it's about visibility, dominance, and fear. These structures may be explained in legal terms, but they have deep emotional and psychological effects. They tell people where they can and cannot go. They create pressure, they limit freedom, and they build a landscape of division. Mahmoud Darwish once wrote, "Houses are murdered just as their inhabitants are killed." That line captures a truth often missed. A home is more than a shelter. It holds memory. It carries family history, safety, and identity. When a house is destroyed, it is not only the structure that is lost, it is a life. That's why demolitions hurt even when no one is inside. That's why forced evictions leave more than physical damage. The violence is slow, but the effects are lasting. We see this in other places too. In New Orleans, when the Claiborne Avenue overpass was built through the Treme neighborhood, it wasn't just about traffic. It broke up a thriving black community. It turned a space of culture and gathering into a dark, loud underpass. The people weren't killed, but something was: their shared space, their access to opportunity, their ability to build and sustain community life. And that decision was made by planners and politicians who saw the land as empty, or at least available, because it belonged to people with less power. This is why we must reframe how we talk about architecture. It isn't just about design, it's about ethics, about responsibility, about what kind of future we are building and for whom. Architects, planners, and developers make decisions that shape the lives of thousands. Their work is not just creative, it is moral. And like all moral work, it must be judged not only by beauty or function, but by impact. We should ask harder questions about what we build. Who benefits? Who is harmed? Who was here before? And where did they go? These questions can change how we design. They can shift the goals of architecture from control to care, from exclusion to inclusion, from harm to repair. The good news is that once we see these patterns, we can start to challenge them. We can call out the injustice in a zoning law. We can fight for housing that includes rather than isolates. We can ask architects to listen to the communities they work in, not just the clients who fund them. We can choose to build with memory in mind, with attention to the history of a place and the people who live there. Buildings do not have to hurt. Streets do not have to divide. Walls do not have to trap. But to make that shift, we need to treat architecture as a social force, not just a technical one. We need to treat it as part of how justice is lived or denied. When we speak about the built environment, we're speaking about people's lives. The two are not separate. And when people live in spaces that tell them they don't matter, that message seeps in. But when people live in spaces that support them, that include them, and that honor their presence, something else grows. That too is architecture. And that too must be part of the conversation. Next time you walk past a wall, a fence, or a street corner, ask yourself, who was this built for? And who was it built against? Most people don't think to question the space around them. Roads are just roads. Buildings are just buildings. But once you start looking closer, you see how space reflects power. You see how some streets welcome while others divide. How some walls protect and others trap. You begin to notice who gets the view, who gets the noise, and who gets left behind. Architecture is more than design. It shapes how people live, where they can go, and what they can access. A stairwell without an elevator speaks to who is expected to use the building. A park surrounded by gates tells you who it's meant to include and exclude. It's easy to walk past these things without noticing, but noticing is the first step to understanding, and understanding is the first step toward change. If you want to learn more, look into the work of forensic architecture. They use architecture to investigate war crimes and human rights abuses. They take images, sounds, maps, and videos and turn them into tools for justice. You can explore their projects online at the Forensic Architecture website. The site includes visuals, case files, and walkthroughs that explain how they gather and present evidence. Their work shows how careful observation, combined with technology and research, can reveal truths hidden in plain sight. You can also watch the documentary series Rebel Architecture, especially the episode titled The Architecture of Violence. It follows Eyal Weizman as he travels through the West Bank and shows how architecture is used to control space and people. It's not just a film about buildings, it's about how those buildings are part of a larger system, one that shapes lives through walls, roads, and ruins. For a deeper dive, read Hollowland, written by Weizmann himself. The book takes a close look at the occupied territories of Palestine and shows how architecture is used not only to build but to dominate. It explains how military strategy and design overlap and how control is embedded into the very landscape. Start small. Look around your own neighborhood. Who gets benches? Who gets trees? Who gets cameras? Who gets nothing at all? The answers won't come all at once, but they're there. And once you see them, it becomes hard to look away.